In this video, I want to discuss some observations about the Torah regarding the tabernacle or tent of meeting and the idea of the temple. This discussion will be more meaningful if you've seen my video about prophets and prophecy and also my video about the word olam. And you can see both of these videos by checking the links in the description box if you're interested. If you watch all of this video, it's likely that you'll begin to notice things in the commands that you didn't notice before. And in a sense, you may see things that were not seeable before, even though it was obviously always there. And this is similar to what I personally experienced as I began to consider this issue myself. These things were in the text before, but I never really noticed it until a certain point because my mindset was not attuned to recognizing it. And that's not to say that I think that I have all this figured out or anything like that, because I don't necessarily believe that about anything, but I do think it is a relevant piece of the puzzle, and I think it is a piece of the puzzle that has been obscured and ignored for a number of reasons. So first, I'm going to kind of set the frame and discuss some issues that may affect our interpretation of this, and then I'm going to go into some of the words which are used in the Torah, and then I will share and talk about a series of passages in the text. I realize that what I'm about to get into regarding the tabernacle is not the popular view whatsoever, and that's the reason why I'm going to take some time to set the frame for this beforehand. In fact, I'd never even heard of anyone else holding this view or anything similar to it until I started talking about it online several years ago. When I mentioned what I was seeing, there were people that started messaging me and telling me that they had also independently come to that conclusion. Of course, it's rare that this idea is actually entertained because it requires a particular view on the Torah. It requires that a person holds the Torah and its commands as the foremost piece of scripture that everything else must fit with. Whatever comes after the Torah shouldn't contradict it because the Torah is the foundational document. Now that may seem odd to suggest because most people that recognize the Torah as authoritative would agree on some level that the Torah is the foundational document of the belief system, and everything that comes after it hinges upon it in one way or another. It sets the frame for everything else because it is the system that Elohim set up for his people. Everything else refers back to it, and as a result requires the Torah to be credible in order for them to have any credibility. And this is something that I elaborate on in my video regarding prophets and prophecy, which I believe goes into some important fundamental points regarding the overall subject of Scripture and the issue of faith and the interplay between those two. One thing I discuss is how it is easier to dismiss a prophet or to actually test a prophet against what the Torah says whenever we've never heard of the person or the prophecy. And as a result of having never been exposed to that prophecy or that prophet before, we have absolutely no investment in accepting the person or the content of his or her prophecy. In fact, dismissing of prophets or testing of prophets like that is probably something we have already done many times without giving much thought to it. In those situations where we're dealing with an outside prophet, it's much easier to assess whether the content of the prophecy is in line with the Torah or not. If the prophecy commands something which is a violation of the Torah, assuming we are aware of that command in the Torah, we're going to notice that problem with that prophecy. But not every situation is like that. While I know this is not the case for everyone, the reality is that whenever we came to accept the Torah as the system which Elohim commanded for his people, and accepted it as the way in which we are commanded to walk, we either already believed a number of prophets which came after the Torah, or at the same time that we accepted the Torah, we also accepted a number of future prophets which came after the Torah. And in the process, we may have not made any real distinction between these different prophets. Maybe we accepted a collection of prophets because that was the rabbinic tradition on which prophets are supposed to be believed, Or maybe we accepted a collection of prophets because that was the official Catholic canon, or that was the official Protestant Christian tradition on which prophets are supposed to be believed. Or maybe we didn't really think of it in those terms, but maybe something like that effectively did happen. At some point, we may have some sort of mindset shift on this issue and realize that, okay, we should be testing the prophets which come after the Torah, given what the Torah says about false prophets, especially when we have noticed certain things in certain books, like maybe with Paul, for example. But by that point, we may already be effectively in it. We're not in the same situation as we would be when we're looking at some foreign prophet that we've never heard of or that no one else around us has ever heard of. One part of that is that a person may have an investment of some sort in accepting traditionally accepted prophets. Part of a person's belief system may essentially be tied to the acceptance of such a future prophet, and it may seem to the person like there is a spiritual or theological need to continue with those traditionally accepted prophets. That can certainly be an issue with how a person's mindset is shaped regarding how we look at the Torah. Also, from a purely cynical view, I can say from experience, at least from what it seems to me, that your personal acceptance of certain prophets or certain sets of prophets heavily influences whether certain other people will accept you. I think a basic human desire, at least for some of us, is connection with other people, and that should not be overlooked. I've talked with a number of people over the years that have had a spouse or a significant other that did not believe the same way, and the person was either often afraid to act on what they thought was true and right, or they were afraid of continuing to do what they thought was true and right because they wanted things to be resolved with their spouse that disagreed with them. And from what I've witnessed, the vast majority of the time, the one that believed in the Torah ended up being the one that caved and gave up on things for the sake of the other person. So clearly it's not just a matter of recognizing the truth, because a person can convince themselves out of the truth that they have already recognized if there is enough personal motivation. And if that can happen after a person sees the truth, it can certainly happen before a person sees the truth. Also, when it comes to connecting with other people outside of our immediate relationships, even just with regard to those of us that believe in the Torah, our current environment seems to be pretty decisive, and that does not help. It's possible I'm just hallucinating this, or maybe it has just been an issue of randomness with what I have witnessed or experienced, but it seems like there's kind of a hair trigger at times to very quickly cut people off and shun them, even if there's something like a 95% agreement otherwise. If something like that really is going on and I'm not just seeing a pattern that's not actually there, then I really wonder about what we're going to do in the future if some type of real difficulty is hoisted upon us. And also, if that is the case, I think it may be utopian thinking to assume that Elohim is just going to resolve all of our differences for us. So I don't know what to think of that, but coming back to the issue of people's beliefs being affected by the people that are around them, I would be surprised if the situation hasn't affected a number of people's beliefs, because in the past I know that I have felt the motivation to conform and the motivation to accept other people's opinions on prophets even, just to escape that. And similarly, I've witnessed other people say outright that they're afraid of accepting the truth because that means that many people reject them. So I don't intend to get into a whole big thing on that subject right now, but it certainly does come into play in a variety of ways, such as with whether we test prophets or not, regardless of whether or not it hypothetically should influence us. The other side of this issue of testing prophets is that if we have accepted certain prophets in the past, those prophets have already set the frame for how we view the Torah. Just like how the news or education or other sources can set the frame for how we look at what's going on in the world, even though a person that has been exposed to those things is going to assume they're looking at things objectively, we're already pre-primed to think about things a certain way, whether that is reality or not. So even if we think to ourselves that we're going to test a prophet that we previously assumed to be true, then we may not even be able to see what the Torah actually says because that frame has already been set. It becomes very difficult because we're still effectively in it. The theological beliefs, especially certain ones, tend to be very resistant to any sort of update from new information, and we may not even have the ability to look at the Torah for what it says about itself in isolation. Even if a person is just currently only believing in the Torah and trying to be objective about other prophets, it may take years of studying what the Torah says about the Torah before a person is able to update their views on the Torah, especially about certain issues. Obviously, there's more detail to this discussion and more to think about, and I go into some more of that in the aforementioned prophet video, so feel free to check that out. These same sorts of issues set the stage for how we view the subject of the temple and the tabernacle, which I'm going to get into now. As far as the overall issue of the commanded rituals and the commanded offerings and such, I think that for a lot of us, it's easy to kind of gloss over the description of these sorts of things. The fact that the institution of these things is not currently active, at least not in the way described in the commands, means that it doesn't have the same immediate weight to it as the other commands, at least in the way we might perceive it. That's not to say it should be that way, and I believe that those things do matter and that they are important and that they are required to be done according to the way they are commanded because they are commanded. For some of you, I know that sacrifices may be thought of as entirely obsolete, but the reality is that not every sacrifice or offering has to do with sin. Many of them do relate to the issue of sin, and that is true, but that's not the only aspect of it. Even though that part of the Torah might seem like a strange and foreign thing to us, it is a part of the commanded worship, and there is more importance to it than that very narrow way of thinking about it that we may have heard before. Sacrifices and offerings are even described as being the food of Elohim, or the bread of Elohim, in Leviticus 21. Even though that may initially seem odd, I think it should inform us that there is more to this issue. All that being said, my underlying point about how much we pay attention to these commands is that obviously we're going to prioritize the things we study just as a matter of practicality. If we want to follow the law, and if there are some instructions that we can follow in the immediate here and now, clearly those are going to be prioritized. That institution and the ritual commands associated with it fell apart, in my opinion, probably closer to 3,000 years ago, and since it fell apart, these instructions end up being largely theoretical to us. And if it is theoretical rather than concrete, it makes it easier to not really process it as we're reading it. It makes it easier to not even read it at all. I think that's understandable. I know from personal experience that if we're not really paying much attention to it, then we easily may not have noticed some of the things which we'll look at. I want to highlight two key terms which appear in the Torah regarding this issue. The first is what is literally translated as tent of meeting. If you're using a translation, this is fairly typical, but sometimes it's rendered as tabernacle of the congregation, or tent of appointment, or other things. I think tent of meeting is a pretty solid translation for this term, and it appears many times in the Torah. We see it very commonly whenever we look at the commands regarding the rituals and the commanded offerings and slaughters, which are described at the beginning of Leviticus, among other places. And I should mention that regardless of how the overall phrase is rendered, whenever the first word appears by itself, it is typically rendered as tent. This is what we see in passages like Exodus 16, when it talks about the Israelites in their tents, and we see the resulting phrase, tent of meeting, many times in the passages relevant to this issue. There's another term which I want to point out, which is mishkan. Mishkan is clearly connected with the previous, but it is a separate term. This word is usually translated as tabernacle. Sometimes it appears side by side with tent of meeting, and it is used almost synonymously. Other times it appears by itself in reference to it and or the associated structures. To be absolutely clear, just in case, there is no association between this word and the word used in Feast of Tabernacles or Sukkoth. There's no connection between these two words. I thought I'd mention that because I have heard of that connection being alleged before, but it's not actually legitimate to the Hebrew. However, there is a connection between the word mishkan, tabernacle, and its root verb, which shows up a number of times in the Deuteronomy passages, which we're going to get into now. You're probably aware of how Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 16 refer to the place which Elohim is going to set his name. This is worded a few different ways, but it is said a number of times in the context of doing sacrifices and offerings, and also observing the pilgrimages such as the Passover. For example, it shows up in Deuteronomy 12, 5 through 6, in reference to doing these sorts of things in the future after entering into the land. It says he is going to choose a place to set or place his name there. And we are supposed to seek his dwelling, or where he is residing, or his tabernacling. In this case being the root verb from which tabernacle is derived, as discussed. And by the way, that fact may or may not be relevant. And that place he chooses is where we are supposed to bring the offerings. Before this command, it refers to the destruction of the places of worship that exist in the land as they are coming into it. And it says that we are not supposed to do things in that way. So one way of reading that is that the nations, the inhabitants of the land, had all of these different worship sites, whether on mountains or hills or under trees, and that instead there is just going to be one worship site. And this reading appears to be supported by what comes later in the chapter in verses 13 and 14. Instead of just offering sacrifices in any place that we see fit, we are supposed to do it at the place which he shall choose. And it is at that place which we are supposed to do all which we are commanded. Presumably, all which I am commanding you would include the details of the offerings as described in Leviticus and otherwise, and I will make note of some of these details shortly. As alluded to, this command reappears a number of times in different forms or in slightly different contexts throughout these chapters. In the land, Elohim is going to choose a particular place, and he is going to place his name there, or he is going to make his name reside there, or tabernacle there, or he is going to cause his notoriety to be established there, depending on the particular wording and how that wording is understood. Once again, we see the same root verb from which tabernacle is derived, but that's not necessarily relevant, at least not every time it appears. And then, at that location he has chosen, that is where the various rituals will be done. So for me, whenever I first recognized this passage, my initial assumption was that this must be talking about how we're not supposed to sacrifice just wherever, and that instead there is going to be a chosen place in the land, and presumably that's the place where a temple might be built, and the place is where the sacrifices are going to be done. Of course, at that time, I hadn't studied the sacrifices and the related rituals and the commands, and I hadn't read what the Hebrew text says in the sacrificial commands either, so I didn't recognize any other possibilities with that passage. And from what I've read in various traditional writings and otherwise, that view or something very close to it appears to be a pretty popular understanding for that passage, even though in my opinion that's reading heavily into it and going beyond what the text directly says. At this point, I think it's important to recognize two things. One is in reference to these offerings which we're going to be doing at the place. It refers to them paraphrased as all which we were commanded. Presumably that would imply that we're supposed to do the sacrifices the way we are commanded to do them in the Torah. So if the command says we're supposed to offer a male sheep, for example, then we wouldn't offer a female sheep. And if the command says we're supposed to offer a bird, then we wouldn't offer a fish. And if the command says we're supposed to do something on one side of the altar, or that the priests are supposed to do something on one side of the altar, then we wouldn't do it on the other side of the altar, etc. Presumably, the way to do it will be the way it is commanded in the Torah. I'm sure that's obvious, but keep that in mind as we continue. Also, as far as these passages in Deuteronomy 12 and so forth are concerned, the verses which refer to the place do not say that there's going to be some new building constructed at that place. It doesn't describe any such thing in any way as far as I can tell. It just says that we're going to be doing the things which we were commanded regarding the offerings at that location. He's choosing a place from all the tribal allotments to place his name there. It doesn't describe what that is supposed to entail in any detail, even though my initial view, which I described of this passage, basically projected onto it some of those ideas, despite them not actually being explicit in the passage. Recalling what I described at the beginning of the video regarding future prophets, I have observed that this command and some related commands in the law are subjected to something very similar. I mentioned that if there is a prophet that's already accepted, even if we assume that the Torah is the ultimate rule on the subject, we may unintentionally let the prophet set the frame for how we view the Torah. Certain prophets may predispose us to seeing certain commands in a certain light. Of course, it's possible that such a view is the correct angle, but if we've already accepted the prophet, then we may not be able to seriously compare that view with any alternative. In this context, the frame that I'm referring to is the idea that the temple is supposedly the commanded way, that a temple is a clear expectation and is supposedly authorized by the Torah, even though the word which means temple never even appears in the Torah, and even though there are many commands which say otherwise. Whenever I've studied things like the incense recipe described at the end of Exodus 30, for example, I don't know how many times I've seen that passage labeled by scholars as the passage with the recipe for Solomon's temple incense, even though the passage itself indicates that the incense is made for a very exclusive use and is for the tent of meeting, obviously saying nothing about Solomon's temple. Of course, there is a way of explaining why one might frame it in that way, but this frame is very embedded in the way which things are popularly thought of. As a result, it's hard to even recognize what the Torah commands say. One thing that is hard for me to not draw attention to now whenever I read about the sacrifices and many of the other rituals is where the command says it's supposed to be done. Let's look at some examples which appear in the Torah. Leviticus 1 gives commands about the burnt offering or the ascent offering, and presumably that is a part of the way which we are commanded to do these things. And it says in verse 3 that the offering is commanded to be brought to the opening of the tent of meeting. If we continue with the description of that offering, it goes on to say in verse 5 that the blood is supposed to be sprinkled on the altar, and it even says where the altar is located, which is at the opening of the tent of meeting. Leviticus 3 speaks similarly. The peace offering is slaughtered at the opening of the tent of meeting. And this is part of the command. It repeats that 3 times in this same chapter. In the next chapter, whenever it describes the priest doing a sin offering, it says where he is supposed to do it, which is at the opening of the tent of meeting. And this is mentioned 7 more times after it in that same chapter. The next passage I want to highlight is in Leviticus 6, and depending on the numbering system you are using, it is either in verses 9 through 11 or verses 16 through 18. Regarding the tribute offering, Aaron and his sons are commanded to eat some of it. It says where they're supposed to eat it, which is in the courtyard of the tent of meeting. At the end of that passage, it tells us it is a command of olam, and it is a command for your generations. So as I described in my video about the word olam, it may not be the precise meaning of the word, but practically speaking, this is supposed to be a command forever. And part of the command relies on the use of the tent of meeting, and that's not the only time that the word olam is used in connection with the tent of meeting. Likewise, with the Day of Atonement or Day of Covering, Leviticus 16 mentions the Tent of Meeting repeatedly. Just like with many of the other offerings, it is an explicit part of the command for the ritual. He is bringing the goats there in verse 7. The priest is changing his clothes at the tent of meeting in verse 23. Also in verses 33 and 34, he is making atonement or covering for the tent of meeting, among other things. And it says this is a commandment of olam, an enduring commandment. There are many other examples in the text of commands which are worded similarly and which require the tent of meeting in order to do them. There are also other passages which indicate this, and they even indicate that it's not just a part of being in the wilderness, but it will continue in the land. In Leviticus 27:30, it describes the tenth of the land, or the tithe. It is being separated from the grain of the land and the fruit of the land, so clearly it's in the context of being in the land rather than being in the wilderness. And if we go to Numbers 18:21, it describes the tribe of Levi being given all of it as an exchange for their service in the tent of meeting. So if they are receiving payment from the yield of the land, then the tent of meeting is persisting in the land. In verse 23, it says he is serving the service of the tent of meeting. And apparently this is commandment of olam, and it is for your generations. So apparently this was expected to continue, that is, the use of the tent of meeting. Practically speaking, the tent of meeting service is commanded to be done forever. One of the blessings in the Torah of being in the land and doing the commands involves the tabernacle also. In Leviticus 26, it refers to being in the land and receiving the rain and yield of the land and being at peace in the land. And then, in verse 11, it says that he will give his tabernacle in our midst. While it doesn't say tent of meeting here like it did in Numbers 18, the word mishkan or tabernacle is frequently used in association with the tent of meeting. Those two terms, as mentioned earlier, are clearly associated with each other in the Torah. This also reminds me of a passage in Exodus 29. In verse 44, it says that he is making the tent of meeting holy, or set apart, or sacred. And he is doing the same thing for the altar and for Aaron and his sons. Then it says he will reside in the midst of the sons of Israel, and he shall be our Elohim. And they shall know he is their Elohim, that he brought them forth to reside in their midst. So we have the fact that the Torah does not explicitly say anything about a temple, but it says many things explicitly about the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting is, by its very nature, the commanded holy place of the Torah. It is the sanctuary and the house of Elohim described in the Torah, and a large number of commands hinge upon it continuing to exist, even existing in the land. Many of these commands say that they are olam, and that they are for your generations. There are many other commands like these, which I did not mention, which you will now begin to notice whenever you read the ritual commands in the Torah. There is no lack of commands which rely on the tent of meeting in order to do them. That being the case, wouldn't we expect that the changing and alteration of all these commands would be explained ahead of time in the law? Isn't it odd that while Deuteronomy repeatedly explains there's going to be a place chosen from the tribal allotments where the rituals are going to be done, it never says anything about building a new structure. It never says anything about destroying the commanded tent of meeting. If we had never heard anything about these prophecies about a temple or temples, would we not see these passages as just saying there will be a permanent site in the land for the tent of meeting?